Rome 61 CE, 1 year after the revolt of the predial slaves in Apulia. We picture Roman slaves as helpless property, but the law didn't always agree. From imperial edicts to tense urban riots, limits on cruelty emerged over time. Sources estimate 400 slaves executed after Pedanius Secundus was murdered by one. As estates expanded, and the Annona strained control demanded negotiation, not just force. So what could a dominus legally do, and what risked revolt? It was the largest execution in Rome since the days of Sulla's proscriptions. 400 people, slaves, all some only children, condemned to death not for what they had done, but for the silence of one. The populus Romanus used to spectacle was shaken by the scale, but law cared little for sentiment. When Pedanius Secundus, urban prefect and senator, was murdered in 61 CE by one of his own household slaves, precedent, not mercy, carried the day. The Lex Familiae had long held that if a master was killed by a slave, every fellow slave under that roof bore indirect guilt. It was legal logic rooted in deterrence that fear should enforce loyalty where law could not inspect. But Pedanius had kept a vast domus with some 400 enslaved individuals, servants, stewards, children, and tradesmen living under his command. The solitary killer had acted alone. Still, the Senate convened under Nero's administration confirmed the sentence. All must die. Crowds flooded the streets. Many Roman citizens, no friends to slavery per se, objected not from tenderness but from dread. Most city households relied on slave labor, many of them urban professionals working in close contact. If the dominus could not shield even the innocent from collective death, then the social bond of loyalty between master and servant was fractured. As unrest stirred near the Subura with plebeian crowds, shouting outside, the curia soldiers were deployed to secure the forum and ensure the executions proceeded without interruption. The systemic driver was demography, specifically the density and dependence of Rome's urban core. The low birth rates among citizens and steady influx of enslaved peoples from eastern wars and African ports created a capital where perhaps 1 in 3 residents was legally unfree. The large household of Pedanius was unusual in size, but not in form. Roman senatorial families had long competed through conspicuous expansion of staff and service. The incident forced an uncomfortable question into public view. What, after all, were the limits of a master's right? The horror of the executions reignited old debates inside the legal colleges and among magistracies. It would still be decades before the Lex Petronia emerged to restrict arbitrary punishments by forbidding the sending of slaves to fight wild beasts without municipal approval, a narrow ruling but a start. Jurists rooted in the Roman law of persons had to reckon with a contradiction. If slaves were property, how could responsibility be shared? Yet if they were quasi-persons in law, did they not require some minimal standard of justice? One rehooked tension lay hidden in plain sight. For even as the law executed indiscriminately, it also allowed certain enslaved men, usually highly skilled or trusted aspect of peculium, rights, the legal right to manage money or contracts in their own name held in technical trust by the master. In the same decade, slave managers operated water systems, temple treasuries, and port customs houses. The economy needed them. Legal limits might curb cruelty, yes, but too much restraint and the hierarchy slackened. Too little in Rome risked unrest from its most essential class. Senatorial backlash was immediate but fragmented. Some decried the crowds as disloyal, greedy elements infected by Eastern softness. Others urged clearer statutes, but no law emerged to prevent future enforcement of the lethal precedent. Instead, it lingered like a dagger across generations, unspoken but unsheathed in moments of elite panic. Behind the ritual of decimation, and amid the blood in the atrium, Rome glimpsed a deeper fragility. Slavery was not only domination, it was interdependence. Every servant punished was a functionary, lost a port tally gone, unrecorded a steward desk, unfilled a latrine, uncleaned a sewer grate forgot. The boundary between retribution and ruin narrowed each year. And as grain ships docked at Ostia with late cargoes and aqueducts groaned under diverted labor, the question sharpened, not whether Rome could punish more, but whether it could afford to. One slave stirred the dagger, but 400 were condemned to die. In 61 CE, Rome's faith in precedent outweighed its mercy. The urban prefect Lucius Pedanius Secundus was murdered by one of his own household slaves inside his domus in the heart of the city. Under Roman law, that act was not an isolated crime. The household slaves of a murdered master, children, elders, and infants included, were all deemed complicit unless they had clearly intervened to protect him. It was an expression of dominus authority deeply embedded in the Roman understanding of collective responsibility. The Senate upheld this interpretation without hesitation. All 400 slaves attached to Pedanius's household would be executed. What followed was not silence but uproar. For the first time in living memory, a Roman crowd protested in open defiance. Massing near the Curia Julia in the Forum, they demanded clemency for the innocent, the infants, the caretakers, the cooks and scribes who could not have wielded a blade. But beneath the optics of cruelty lay a deeper fear that relaxing this precedent would undermine the legal principle that slaves must live under total surveillance by their masters. A master's power to punish, like a magistrate's power to fine or exile, was considered foundational to Roman order. Urban unrest forced the Senate to call in troops. Soldiers dispersed the gathering under arms, and the executions proceeded likely by crucifixion outside the city walls. A reminder that law in the Roman world, especially the law concerning slaves, knew few limits. So long as the dominus remained within his ius vitae nescis, the sanctioned right of life and death over his property. Yet the law hid a loophole. The Lex Petronia had not yet been enacted. Once it appeared years later, it would require a magistrate's approval for such mass punishments, curbing spontaneous cruelty. But in 61 CE, that check did not exist. Nor was it yet common for jurists to distinguish between individual agency and abstract guilt in slave matters. The killing of Pedanius reopened that debate not just in the courts but in Rome's conscience. The Senate won, the law held. But the method of its enforcement, military force against Rome's own people, called that victory into question. Behind this legal drama stood the real pressure point: demography. By the mid-1st century CE, the city of Rome hosted an estimated population of over 1 million. Enslaved laborers of every kind, domestic, skilled, and public, enabled the daily function of markets, temples, palaces, and port granaries. The more indispensable they became to the civic structure, the more dangerous it seemed to assert total impunity over them. The killing of a master could not go unanswered, but total retaliation, visible, unblinking, risked making the system appear fragile rather than strong. Some senators, especially those with bonded households on remote estates, saw danger in hesitation. Slaves, in their eyes, needed to fear reprisal more than they could hope for justice. Others, particularly jurists trained in the evolving imperial administration, saw an opportunity to begin codifying distinctions between failure to report a conspiracy and mere inability to resist it between grown men, with keys to the atrium, and infants who had never stepped beyond the triclinium. In silence, Roman law took its first hesitant steps toward limits. The physical edifice of domination stood unchanged. But behind it, pressure was building, not from virtue, but from visibility, not from sentiment, but from scale. What followed the executions, however, was overlooked in the Senate's triumph. In the tabularium, records of manumissions rose modestly over the next 5 years, especially in central Italy. Households chosen for magistracies began discreetly freeing promising servile youths, calculating status optics against civic backlash. The lexicon of ownership was not abandoned, but it was increasingly managed. And further west in Hispania, rumors filtered back of a different crime and a different slave. When Hadrian came to power 6 decades later, those distant tremors would come roaring back through law. 400 souls in one domus and one man dead. But which injustice shocked Rome more, the murder of the master or the scale of the punishment? In 61 CE, within the palatial residence of the Prefectus Urbi Lucius Pedanius Secundus, a slave struck down his dominus. Roman law did not record the motive, only the act. Under existing custom, the blow demanded a terrible reckoning. The Senate, invoking precedent rooted in ancestral law, ordered the execution of every slave under that household's roof, male and female adult, and child none spared. The legal doctrine was collective culpability. If one slave murdered the master, every other had allowed it by failing to intervene. It was not inattentiveness the law punished, but failure to protect the dominus's person, seen as sacrosanct within the household order. Crowds gathered outside the Curia Julia in protest, an unusual show of dissent for the regime of Nero, still a young princeps. Thousands decried the ruling not just for its brutality, but for its proximity. These enslaved servants had lived among them, moved among their own doorways in the Subura, or around the Forum Halatorium. The urban prefect, now vacant, was a prestigious post, one that coordinated logistics, oversaw security, and interfaced regularly with Rome's vast enslaved and freed labor force. To the plebs urbana, this was not a foreign massacre in a distant province. It was a mass execution in the heart of the capital. Undeterred, the Senate held its ground. The principle of deterrence overrode the murmur of conscience. Urban cohorts were dispatched to ensure order as the executions proceeded. The mechanics of class and danger were clear. A household large enough to hold 400 slaves represented not just private wealth, but also a potential insurrectionist nucleus. The fear-born memory of Spartacus still lingered in the political mind of Rome. And Rome, the city itself, not the empire, sat atop an infrastructure increasingly dependent on enslaved labor. From the warehouses of the Emporium Port District, to the state-managed Horia, from the Annona supply to the urban sewer cleaners, the functional city relied on enslavement woven into municipal services. This was not simply about vengeance. It was about optics and control in a demographically tilting capital. Estimates suggest that enslaved persons may have comprised nearly 1/3 of Rome's urban population by the mid-1st century CE. Slaves managed not only households, but guild workshops, temple treasuries, district aqueducts. Their access to information, mobility, and in some cases peculium quasi-legal personal savings complicated their social location. The dominus still ruled in law, but the city itself had begun to operate on systems of trust and negotiation, not pure coercion. Yet the law hid a loophole. The Lex Petronia, a statute later requiring magistrate approval for a master to subject his slave to combat with wild beasts, had not yet been enacted. There were no procedural buffers. So long as dominus authority remained formally unlimited, the Senate was bound to uphold precedent. Law here served not morality but continuity. Still, the shockwaves endured. Legal minds in the imperial bureaucracy began to debate whether absolute power within the domus might create external disorder. Stoic philosophers like Seneca would later challenge the morality of cruelty. But the case of Pedanius Secundus forced a more immediate calculation. Could Rome afford to brutalize a labor class so numerically dense and functionally essential, without inviting eventual collapse? The volume of manumissions recorded in subsequent decades hints at quiet recalibration. Not revolution, not reform, but adaptive release. A shift begun not by empathy but by threat. The real fear now was not only of what a slave might do within the domus, but what the people might tolerate beyond its walls. The fault line had opened, but the system held for now. In the shadowed atriums of the elite, the tension between mastery and mutual interdependence would not be so easily buried. Even in an empire forged by conquest and governed by law, not all power went unchecked. What could not be done to a slave in Rome? In rare cases, the answer was whatever the crowd would not abide. In 61 CE, the angry ghost of a murdered magistrate threw Roman justice into crisis. Gaius Pedanius Secundus, urban prefect of the capital, was stabbed to death in his own domus by one of his household slaves. The culprit was swiftly identified. But Roman law, specifically the principle of collective punishment for slave households, demanded that all under the same roof share the fate of the killer. That meant not just the servant with a blade, but nearly 400 enslaved men, women, and children. The legal precedent was clear. Any slave who failed to prevent a master's murder was complicit by omission. Yet when the Senate confirmed the sentence, protests erupted in the Forum and near the Forum Boarium. By now, over 1/3 of Rome's population lived in some form of enforced servitude. The idea that a child could be executed alongside a steward or doorkeeper unearthed a social tension long buried beneath legal clarity. For 2 days, a volatile crowd surged around the Curia Julia, prompting the urban prefect's successor to deploy cohorts urbani, Rome's paramilitary policing force, to restore order. Why did the Senate not relent despite the danger of urban unrest? Because the crime had struck at the heart of imperium, not merely domestic discipline. Pedanius had not been a private citizen. He had held imperium domi, the right to command within Rome itself. To let his killer's fellows live with, some senators insisted, dissolve the boundary between master and subject, privilege and property. But the aftershocks of the massacre did not vanish with the crowd. Jurists at the auditors' deliberaties, imperial boards that routinely managed appeals involving freedmen and slaves, began to question the long unstudied assumptions hidden in the punishment code. If the state now deployed public force to shield judicial executions from public outcry, could that same state admit limits to a master's power in the future? Rome's economic dependency on compounded slavery had by this period narrowed tolerance for instability. With the imperial grain fleet increasingly reliant on enslaved porters along the Tiber, and in Portus Augusti, the emperor's harbor system, disruptions to labor flows posed not just political problems but logistical ones. Secundus' case had revealed that cruelty could incur costs, not from the victims but from the urban masses who lived beside them. Yet the law hid a loophole. While the Senate clung to precedent elsewhere in the empire, exceptions had already begun to accumulate. In Corinth, Ostia, and even provincial Augusta, emerita manumission records showed a rising frequency of liberty-freed slaves, particularly among skilled laborers and accountants. Some of these had managed peculium, a semi-legal personal fund that blurred the boundary between property and permission. The accumulation of peculium allowed certain enslaved individuals to buy their freedom, or that of their kin, conferring a quasi-status that complicated absolute ownership. By holding steady on the executions, the Senate believed it defended mos maiorum, the ancestral custom. But ideologically, it conceded nothing to the realities of dependency. The Rome of 61 CE was no longer the martial republic of Cato, but a bureaucratic engine fed by anonymous labor. The real constraint on cruelty, increasingly, was not philosophy or sentiment, but scale, the terrifying scale of Rome's urban fragility. In whispered tones and scribed rulings, imperial advisors to Nero began reassessing the limits of dominus authority in private households, not out of charity, but out of fear that the next flashpoint might not be contained by soldiers. By the reign of Hadrian, a codified check on extrajudicial slave executions would appear, but those seeds were sown decades earlier not by law, but by blood in the atrium. The question remained, how long could the law reflect pure will when the city itself had become a hostage to order? A single act of violence could set 400 lives on a knife's edge, but whose life and which law truly counted in Rome? In 61 CE, the city trembled over the answer. The murder of Lucius Pedanius Secundus, the prefectus urbi, struck not just at a man, but at a principle. One of his own household slaves had killed him, motive unknown, method unrecorded. But Rome's ancient code of control responded with pitiless clarity: all slaves under his roof guilty or not must die. The Senate invoked mos maiorum, ancestral custom, backed by statute. Under collective guilt, familia urbana or rural gang alike could be destroyed if one member revolted. Estimates of Secundus's household range near 400 souls, including women and likely children. None were judged individually. All were condemned. Crowds surged in protest. Not citizens defending equality, but plebeians, many dependent on the labor of enslaved handlers, artisans, or accountants, who feared the precedent. Urban cohorts were dispatched to disperse them. No clemency was granted. Imperial Rome asserted that dominus power, no matter how cruel, was necessary for order. But this execution ignited a question with no quick answer: was absolute mastery over the unfree still tenable in a city sustained by them? The incident exposed a system under demographic and bureaucratic strain. As Rome's urban population swelled across the 1st century CE, estimates hover near 1 million. The state became increasingly dependent on enslaved labor at every level. Temple treasuries employed literate slaves as scribe clerks, aqueducts and grain depots relied on chained dock workers, and even port societies like Ostia bore inscriptions from slave and freedman associations, striving for legitimacy within a rigid legal hierarchy. These were not field laborers, but operational functionaries embedded in the machinery of the state itself. Their service required cognition, not just submission, yet the law had not caught up. Lex Petronia, which later forbade masters from selling slaves to gladiator schools or exposing them to wild beasts without a magistrate's approval, had not yet been enacted. Under the Republic and persisting into the early Principate Dominium, legal ownership conveyed near absolute rights, but critical voices were rising. Seneca, writing in Nero's Rome, warned elites against casual cruelty, not from piety but from prudence. A beaten slave, he argued, might one day hold your keys or your knife. The judicial rigidity behind the Secundus decision did not reflect indifference, it reflected fear. The Senate's refusal to commute the sentence preserved the image of unyielding control in a polity dependent on domination. But it also revealed insecurity, a growing realization that mass punishment, while lawful under precedent, could incite the very unrest it sought to prevent. Yet the law hid a loophole. While it permitted the execution, it did not require the slaughter to be immediate. The delay, caused partly by public protest and partly by senatorial debate, provided space for the judiciary to reassess the political price of precedent. No reform followed, not yet, but private jurists began to draft opinions on the treatment of household slaves, including regulations on beatings, confinement, and injury. The groundwork was laid for a later pivot. What forced the issue was not morality but scale. Urban systems like the annona or the temple economies needed continuity more than punishment. A slaughtered slave gang could not balance accounts or keep aqueducts flowing. Rome's power as a bureaucratic empire, not just a military one, was beginning to curtail the old dominus ideal. The body of the master was no longer the only target now. The state itself was vulnerable through labor disruptions. Though the executions went forward, imperial administrators took note. In time, emperors from Hadrian onward would chip away at the master's juridical armor, not to erase slavery but to manage it. But for now, Rome stood bloodied and unchanged. The mobs had scattered, the slaves were dead. Yet the silence that followed was not submission, it was suspense. There would be another killing, another master, another crowd, and with each the chain between cruelty and collapse pulled tighter. A house slave murders his master, but in Rome punishment did not pause to weigh motive. It measured danger, and danger in 61 CE meant spectacle. In that year, Pedanius Secundus, the praefectus urbi charged with the safety of Rome itself, was found dead in his domus on the Caelian hill. The culprit, one of 400 enslaved members of his household, had taken justice into private hands. Why the slave had acted, no senator cared to ask. The issue before them in the Curia was precedent. Roman jurists looked not to sentiment, but to policy, the collective response enshrined by custom and punitive logic. If even one slave in a familia could murder a dominus without consequence to the others, the dominus system unraveled. So the Senate decreed what tradition demanded: all 400 slaves, including infants and scribes, wet nurses, and cooks, were to be executed en bloc. The crowd in the forum, hearing of the verdict, surged in protest. They did not weep for Pedanius. They feared the state's capacity for cold arithmetic. To disperse them, soldiers of the urban cohort drew steel. It was a clash between public order and private dominion, and Rome was choosing order by reinforcing property violence. Yet murmurs echoed beneath the marble: was this the price of stability in a city run on enslaved labor? Roman slaveholding law concentrated power in the hand of the dominus, who could punish, sell, or kill his slaves with few constraints. Property under Roman law res mancipi lacked rights by definition, but logistics and the scale of empire complicated absolutes. Peculium, the quasi-legal personal fund, allowed to urban and skilled slaves, especially those working for state institutions like the Office of the Water Supply or temple treasuries, had become a tolerated necessity. The growing involvement of slaves in vital economic activity, managing accounts, negotiating shipments at portus facilities like Ostia, meant not all could be treated as beatable bodies in chains. This contradiction created systemic tension. On one hand, the dominus retained juridical supremacy within the household. On the other, the imperial bureaucracy required predictability and efficiency from its enslaved administrators. Peculium blurred lines. It incentivized loyalty, but it also gave some slaves the appearance and bargaining position of partial economic selves. Yet the law hid a loophole. Peculium was always in the last instance claimable by the master. It was not rights but revocable privilege. This legal ambiguity became both shield and shackle for slaves in roles too complex to replace or too profitable to risk alienating. Wealthier senators, particularly those with latifundia in Sicilia or North Africa, pushed back against any formal codification of limits. They cited mos maiorum ancestral precedent and declared household sovereignty sacrosanct. But privately they put scribes to work drafting internal rules for slave oversight, pragmatism behind closed shutters. Meanwhile, in urban quarters and port societies, where freedmen and slaves mixed in collegia, the visibility of this legal paradox grew. Inscriptions, deliberate public statements, blurred lines, further proudly naming former slaves who managed grain convoys or temple revenues. The emperor's authority, visible even in epigraphy, began to cast longer shadows over the dominus authority at home. But despite zoning this tension into legal gray, no major change followed the bloodshed of 61 CE. The law survived intact. The system held barely. What cracked was perception. The image of the dominus as unchallengeable gave way to the vertigo of governance. In a city where outsiders built the aqueducts and tallied tax records, the cost of control had to be translated not just into punishment, but into policy. Still, the Senate had chosen death to preserve fear. And fear, once fed, required constant maintenance. The next time a crisis came, food riots, desertions, or whispers of revolt, it would ask the same question: could the state compel through violence alone, or would it have to hedge even the master's whip? A Roman master could beat, sell, or brand his slave, but not without risk. For in the ever-tightening machinery of empire, cruelty was no longer just a private vice. It threatened public order. In 61 CE, inside the stately domus of Pedanius Secundus, the prefectus urbi of Rome's silent fury erupted into violence. One of his own slaves murdered him, motive lost to time. By Roman precedent, the response was not surgical, but total. All 400 of Pedanius's household slaves, including women and children, were sentenced to death. The ancient custom upheld since the Republic dictated collective execution on the assumption that no master could be murdered without some complicity, or at least the negligence, of his enslaved staff. As the news spread beyond the domus into the alleys and forums of the capital, a crowd gathered in protest. The plebs urbana, many with servants and dependents of their own, understood this execution not as justice, but as slaughter. Their unrest grew so heated that soldiers had to intervene to disperse them. The Senate stood firm. The execution was carried out, the blood pooled generously across the sand of the arena, but something under the marble facade had cracked. The Roman economy, especially in the capital, ran not on idealized agricultural self-sufficiency, but on specialized delegated enslaved labor. Domestics, tutors, scribes, porters, cooks, and artisans formed a shadow class across every domus. They worked in and around freedmen, many of them former slaves themselves, whose peculium, their personal legal funds, had bought their entry into the citizen body. But the line between freedom and enslavement could blur. Wealthy patrons often allowed favored slaves to manage peculium in trust, acting as interfaces to the legal world of commerce and litigation, despite their technically non-personal status in Roman law. It was here that the state found itself increasingly entangled. By the early Principate, particularly under Augustus, and then Tiberius, imperial jurists had begun to regulate the function of slave managers and estate accountants. In ports like Ostia, and among the vast logistics networks feeding the Annona, the grain supply, former slaves were essential taxation intermediaries. They needed legal space to operate, but not so much that they undermined the social order. Yet the lex provided little clarity. A dominus could technically revoke a peculium at will, or punish his slave without review. Still whispering beneath the austerity of Latin legal codes, another pressure loomed: imperial stability. Emperors knew that while discipline maintained dominion, destabilization in the capital, or the supply lines, could cost legitimacy. The Pedanius massacre laid bare a problem. What if the cruelty of the few endangered the order of the many? Quietly, ripple effects emerged. Some influential jurists began to question the long-standing assumption of total dominion over slaves, not on moral grounds but logistical ones. Could this absolute authority obstruct commerce, provoke revolt, erode confidence in elite stewardship? The appeals to the mos maiorum, that ancestral code of austere dominance, still echoed through senatorial debates. Yet even as crowds were scattered by soldiers, and the executions justified, imperial administrators began observing the deeper current that Rome's dependency on non-citizen labor required limits, at least when the eyes of the crowd were watching. The Lex Petronia, which would later restrict masters from forcing their slaves into the arena without magistrate approval, was still decades away. But this episode, soaked in blood and civic resentment, widened the space for that legal evolution to occur. At stake was not sentiment but strategy. How much freedom could be risked in the pursuit of control? The contradiction could not be resolved. It could only be managed, until the next provocation tested whether the dominus ruled absolutely or whether the state did. What stopped a Roman master from killing their own slave? For centuries, almost nothing. But as empire expanded, even absolute power met its limits. In 61 CE, inside the opulent home of the urban prefect Pedanius Secundus, located on the Caelian Hill near the heart of imperial Rome, a quiet crime shattered legal norms and social stability. One of Secundus' own household slaves murdered him. The motive remains unclear, perhaps insult, fear, or quiet desperation, but the response was immediately clear. Roman law, rooted in the principle of collective responsibility for enslaved households, demanded vengeance. All 400 slaves of the household, men, women, children, even those far removed from the act, were condemned to die. This was no innovation. The precedent traced back to the Republic, when the familia was not merely property, but a unit under total dominus control. Yet this mass punishment drew an unexpected reaction. A large crowd gathered outside the Senate and on the streets to protest the ruling. Plebeians, artisans, even some equites objected, not because they desired abolition, but because the scale violated their sense of proportion. The threat of mass execution in the name of elite order provoked its own disorder. The Senate, facing pressure but fearing a breakdown of mos maiorum, held the line. The mass execution was carried out under heavy guard. Troops dispersed the crowd. But the episode revealed growing tensions in Rome's urban core, as enslaved populations rose, especially in specialized labor tied to the capital's economy. Their mass punishment threatened more than just morale. It jeopardized logistical continuity. The debate did not end there. In the following decades, particularly under the early Principate, the role of skilled enslaved labor in civil infrastructure became more entrenched. From the port authorities at Ostia to clerical offices within the aerarium militare, slaves were entrusted with vital technical and managerial tasks. Some permitted or persuaded managed peculium, a quasi-legal stash of earnings or assets held at their discretion, but technically owned by the master. This legal gray zone deepened ambiguity. Could a man who managed temple revenues or oversaw aqueduct engineers be killed for insolence as easily as a household servant? Provincial jurists and imperial administrators, especially under Augustus and later Tiberius, began to define the limits of peculium use with quiet intent. Not out of benevolence but out of state interest, a slave trusted with tax receipts or involved in port customs at Aquileia represented an economic node, not a disposable asset. The cost of replacement climbed, the risk of sabotage became real. Roman law evolved not as moral progress but as bureaucratic calculus. By the reign of Hadrian, this tension coalesced into reform. Sometime around 125 CE, an imperial edict prohibited masters from executing slaves without first securing approval from a magistrate. The law emerged following a brutal case in Hispania Tarraconensis, where a landlord's public execution of a slave over theft had sparked localized riots. Roman governors warned the emperor such violence now endangered broader civic stability, especially in increasingly urbanized provincial towns. Hadrian's edict signaled a subtle pivot. The emperor, advised at court by Stoic thinkers like Epictetus, saw order as preferable to arbitrary dominion. Yet the Senate, particularly landlords from Latium and Sicilia, resisted. To them, dominus authority was sacrosanct. Restriction was dilution. But for administrators tasked with maintaining tax flow, infrastructure repair, or port operation, the reform was prudent. Yet the law hid a loophole. While execution now required approval, interrogation under torture, quaestio, remained lawful, and corporal discipline, unless excessive, still escaped oversight. Legal limits existed, but their application was patchy, subject to local governors' initiative and magistrates' disposition. No imperial bureaucracy yet standardized or enforced them with vigor. Still, something had changed. In funerary inscriptions across Rome and port societies like those at Puteoli and Aquileia, formerly enslaved men liberty began recording their status with pride. Their upward motion depended not only on manumission, but also on a functioning presumption of protection under law. In tax accounts and epigraphy, we find their names in proximity to freedmen, shipowners, and civic dealers, signs of systemic interdependence between free and unfree labor. Masters still held coercive power, but they now stood in relationship with empire. Discipline that destabilized public supply, offended urban cohesion, or undermined imperial image, increasingly drew official concern. But the true test would come in crisis. When food distribution faltered, when war drew forces from the city, when mobs surged again in the Forum. In the corridors beneath the Curia and the record halls of the Tabularium, a question remained dormant, not yet resolved. If cruelty endangers Rome more than mercy, who measures the threshold? And when will it break? In 61 CE, the marble atrium of the urban prefect Pedanius Secundus ran slick with blood, his own. A household slave, angered or desperate, had murdered one of the most powerful magistrates in Rome. The question was not the killer's guilt. It was what to do with the other 399 enslaved men, women, and children who had failed to prevent it. The Senate, invoking a strict precedent of republican origin, ruled they all must die. The punishment was collective, standard under Roman custom, by which enslaved persons were not individuals before the law, but extensions of a master's property. When a crowd of citizens gathered in protest outside the Curia Hostilia, demanding clemency, soldiers from the Praetorian Guard were dispatched to restore order. The executions went forward. Rome trembled not from mercy but from unease. The event revealed a tension sewn deep into the imperial city's fabric. Roman dominus power, absolute legal control by a master over his slaves, existed within a state growing increasingly dependent on the unfree to operate its vital machinery. This was not a plantation empire in the modern sense, though rural slavery thrived especially in the grain-yielding latifundia of Sicily. It was an urbanized system reliant on enslaved labor in bookkeeping, temple stewardship, and municipal office work. Whereas the Senate clung to the jus vitae nescis, the imperial administration had begun to see another problem: logistical control. Already informal financial systems granted slaves access to a peculium, a personal fund technically still owned by the master, but often treated as the slave's to manage. It could be used to purchase clothing, arrange housing, or even eventually trigger manumission. Particularly in port economies like Ostia or Nicomedia, the slave was both property and intermediary, a figure whose legal ambiguity complicated business but made it viable. Large-scale grain shipments and temple treasuries often employed enslaved persons not simply as workers, but as managers of record and risk. Yet the law had not caught up, and discipline lagged behind the complexities of dependence. When Hadrian issued his edict around 125 CE, forbidding the outright killing of slaves without a magistrate's order, it was not merely a philosophical gesture. Stoic advisors such as Epictetus had certainly laid the moral groundwork, but the political calculation was clear: cruelty unchecked could provoke instability among the vast enslaved class upon whom cities like Rome increasingly relied. A notorious case in Hispania, details lost to record, but likely involving the death of a skilled slave under brutal treatment, had fanned unrest. Hadrian's edict was thus both legal restraint and logistical valve aimed at preserving order in a volatile labor framework. Yet the law hit a loophole. While direct killing was now regulated, other abuses, whipping, shackling, starvation, remained permissible so long as they stopped short of death. Masters could circumvent restraint with a measure of delay and deceit. Discontent simmered. When 2 decades later a failure of the grain fleet from Alexandria in 148 CE left Rome's warehouses half-empty, hunger swept the Subura and Esquiline. The prefect of the Annona, Tiberius Claudius Quintianus, led urban cohorts to seize grain for redistribution. In the chaos, desertions surged. Among them, entire slave teams from shipping ports and city mills vanished into the hills. The crisis forced bureaucrats to rethink. It was no longer sound policy to allow household cruelty to cause the empire's arteries to collapse. Quiet codifications followed contractual controls, early drafts of what would later become imperial regulae. The goal was not emancipation, but efficiency. An empire that could not discipline its discipline, an irony not lost on Rome's lawyers, risked collapse from within. Still, inequity held the upper hand. As senators fumed over Hadrian's restraint and augurs balked at any limitation on mos maiorum, the question returned: how much of a man must one be to deserve legal protection if one's bloodlines only ran through ledgers? In silence, another revolt formed, not among the citizens, but in the minds of the enslaved, who learned piece by piece which pain the law could no longer ignore. What could a Roman master not do to a slave? Fewer things than one might expect, but far more than the law eventually could ignore. In 61 CE, down the Palatine slope beneath the shadow of the imperial household, the domus of Lucius Pedanius Secundus fell silent. As praefectus urbi, he was more than a wealthy senator. He was the city's top magistrate for urban order. That spring, a member of his household staff, a slave, murdered him. A legal impossibility within a structure that refused to acknowledge enslaved persons as rights holders. But one disruption of the dominus canon forced the state to reckon with the power encoded in ownership. The lex that mattered most was old, unyielding, and brutal. Roman tradition and Senate precedent demanded that, when a master was killed by a slave, all slaves under that roof, men, women, children, be punished by death. This collective responsibility reflected the legal fantasy of the slave body, not as a person, but as property infused with culpa guilt by association. 400 lives stood forfeit after Pedanius's murder. When word of the impending execution spread, the streets of Rome filled not with torches but with protests. A vast crowd assembled near the Forum, challenging not the man's death, but the legal machinery set in motion to avenge it. Soldiers pushed them back. Violence flickered for a moment, Rome's own citizens turning out to defend those without civita's civil standing. The Senate, unmoved, upheld the punishment. The executions proceeded. Yet the pressure on Roman jurisprudence had begun. The central issue was not clemency, it was control. Rome's bureaucratic organs ran on slavery. From the amphor-laden docks at Portus to the grain record offices on the Aventine, enslaved labor was foundational to the functioning of Annona legal administration and elite domestic life. But this dependency bred contradiction. The more complex the imperial system became, the more it required skilled slave labor, bookkeepers, ship clerks, estate managers, who operated with a type of quasi-right. That legal ambiguity was bound up in peculium, a personal store of wealth nominally owned by the master, but often managed, saved, and functionally controlled by the slave. For a port accountant or a farm overseer, peculium enabled targeted efficiency, better records tighter logistics. In an era where navicularii, imperial grain shippers, were often connected to former slaves or sons of freedmen, the practice allowed economic adaptation. But among some jurists and landowners, it raised troubling questions. Could the line between ownership and partnership be crossed? Could obligation outgrow authority? Under emperors like Augustus and Tiberius, provincial administrators began addressing this dependency in less ideological and more strategic terms. Records suggest that in regions like Baetica and Sicilia, where large estates processed export crops for Rome's urban core, jurists began codifying when and how peculium could be reclaimed, seized, or even passed on upon manumission. Loyalty was not the issue, predictability of labor output was. Yet the law hid a loophole. While a dominus could not legally steal a slave's peculium, without cause he could exact economic punishment through corporal discipline, reassignment, or suicide-inducing workloads. The question creeped forward: could cruelty itself threaten the Republic's own logistics? 2 generations later it would. When Emperor Hadrian issued his edict around 125 CE, requiring magistrate approval before a master could execute a slave, the spark was not mercy but management. A case in Hispania exposed a wealthy equestrian who tortured a young slave to death over a suspected theft. The news returned to Rome. The resulting unrest in an Iberian municipium mattered not because it threatened imperial ideology, but because labor disruption endangered imperial output. Grain, wool, wine, all depended on slave trust. Hadrian, advised by jurists steeped in Stoic writings, justified his edict in the language of justice, but enforced it as governance. Senatorial landlords, particularly in Latium and Sicilia, resisted. To them, the edict eroded their mastery over the hearth and the field. But the Principate required a different calculus. Citizen unrest in Rome over executions like those in 61 CE, economic reliance on slave functionaries, legal patronage networks knotted with freedmen. It all made autonomy dangerous but absolute dominion untenable. The empire made no break with slavery, but the scratch of limitation had begun not for the sake of the enslaved, but to secure the machine's estate port forum, that slavery power. Still, a deeper tension remained. Could an empire that depended so thoroughly on owned humans survive, once it placed boundaries on how they could be used? The coming century would see further food shortages, fiscal reform, and religious currents forces more difficult to discipline than any slave.